that. Everyone see that all right? Wonderful. Good evening and welcome everybody to the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition's #HousedAid02 community meeting for the month of February. Tonight, we're going to be talking about just cause eviction with our co-sponsors at Rights and Democracy. At these meetings, we're seeking to create a space where all Vermonters can come together to get involved and talk about these issues, learn about other different affordable housing issues being taken up in Montpelier, and advocate with each other for safe, accessible, and affordable housing for all. Before we start, this meeting will be recorded and uploaded onto VAHC's YouTube page, just so anyone who is here can go back to certain parts, and so that folks who unfortunately could not make it are able to still be involved and participate. You can also find our past meeting videos there, where we talked about Senate Bill 210, the Rental Housing Safety Bill, and full statutory funding of the Vermont Housing and Conservation Trust Fund. So now, before we just continue on, I would love it if the folks in the room could just briefly introduce themselves with their name and preferred pronouns, where they're calling in from tonight, and just a little bit about why affordable housing is important to them. So I'll go first, and then we can popcorn it around the room. So my name is Justin Sursick. I'm the Resident Engagement AmeriCorps Vista with the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition. My preferred pronouns are he, him. I'm calling in tonight from Essex Junction in Chittenden County, Vermont. And affordable housing is incredibly important to me, not just because of the work that I'm involved with and I'm doing, but because as a young professional just starting to get into the workforce, it's something that I'm going to have to grapple with a lot as I try to establish myself. So it is incredibly important to me. If we can popcorn over to David next.
Martins, I'm the director at VAHC. I'm he, him pronouns, and I live in Winooski, also in Chittenden County, and affordable housing is important to me because I'm a renter and I live in Vermont and plan on making Vermont my long-term home. So affordable housing is important to me for all those reasons, and because I think a lot of populations often get overlooked, and so it's so important to me that it's how I make my livelihood. So yeah, then I pass it over to Stephen.
My name is Stephen Box, he, him. I live in Rutland City, and affordable housing is important to me because I believe in housing. My former company was called Home at Last, and I developed housing for formerly homeless families with children in Sacramento, California. Since moving to Vermont, my company is Box Properties LLC, and I own and manage affordable housing. I also am developing some affordable housing. And so I speak from the perspective of my experience as part of the private sector, which provides 85% of the affordable housing in Vermont. And I believe that not only is affordable housing important, but I think it's important that the folks that provide or create or manage affordable housing are at the table, so that our conversations really have some balance and some a wide spectrum of perspective, so that we can collaborate and work as partners in increasing the amount of quality, safe, affordable housing that's available in Vermont, so we can address the housing crisis and partner in solving the problem.
Thank you, Stephen. Why don't we popcorn it over to Tom now?
Yes, so my name is Tom Proctor, he, him pronouns, and I am the Housing Justice Organizer for Rights and Democracy. Housing is important to me because, well, I'm also a renter, so it directly impacts me. I think I've moved house every single year since I was 18, and not really through choice, quite a lot of the time. I understand how much of a drag it is to have this financial burden around my neck, and how the money that I give to my various landlords over the years wasn't doing me any good and isn't doing me any good. And I continue to pump $1,000 a month, 12 grand a year into someone else's pockets without actually ever going to be able to see that money back again. I also know that the housing crisis in Burlington and across Vermont is untenable. We have seen for years what the effect of the housing market does on the working poor, the disenfranchised, marginalized, and it's been happening for a long time. Now it's starting to happen to more and more people, and it's starting to happen to people on salary wages and what we consider the middle class, as we see more and more wealth get concentrated in the hands of fewer and fewer people. And I'm not quite sure what's going to happen unless we actually put in some kind of protections. If we start building actual houses, if we don't start pushing against big corporate, big property money that's kind of coming into our communities across the nation, really, but Vermont especially. Little stat for you: in Burlington during the pandemic, house prices rose 107% in 2 years. 107. If you had a house that was worth 200 grand back in 2020, it is now worth, well, I'm not very good at math, but over 400 grand. So you tell me how anyone young or even old gets onto the property ladder if they're not on there already. So these are issues that I feel that we need to desperately sort out, especially because housing, it's safe, secure housing that you can rely on and be comfortable in and live your life, affects everything that you do. Without a proper roof over your head in a place that you know where you're secure and safe and it's not going to be taken away from you arbitrarily, you have got you're afforded the ability to really be the best person you could possibly be. When that is taken away, life is so much harder, and it's quite literally destroying communities, and it's destroying good people who otherwise would be really valuable community members, and can't be because they're too concerned about where they're going to live in the next month, how they're going to afford that rent, and it's coming to a crisis point basically. So that was a bit of a soliloquy. I'm going to pass over to Gabe.
Evening, gentlemen. I'm a landlord, and I'm curious to see how this legislation is going to affect everybody. And probably I'll listen in first, and then at the end I'll ask some questions and probably play a bit of devil's advocate to see how this is all gonna pan out. Because obviously, for every bit of legislation, there's repercussions. So I'm gonna bounce some of that off you towards the end of your speech here.
We're happy to answer a few of those questions, Gabe, at the end, but hopefully I'll answer a few of them during the presentation itself. But we'll see.
Awesome, thank you. I saw that Heather joined us as well. So if you wanted to quickly introduce yourself too, feel free to. If not, then we can move on to the meeting agenda. So as we just mentioned, Tom is so graciously going to talk to us a little bit about just cause eviction, what it is, what it's about, and what's going on with it at the State House in Montpelier. Then from there, we'll take a short break and then move on to a group discussion that will range anywhere from questions for Tom about just cause, broader discussion on that, and discussion about other issues that folks may have and want to look at regarding affordable housing. From there, we'll have a brief advocacy activity that we're going to attempt over Zoom, though we'll see how that goes since being virtual complicates everything. And we'll see what happens from there. So for now, I'll pass the mic over to Tom. Welcome and thank you so much for talking to us about Just Cause.
You are welcome. This has been quite literally my entire life for like the past 2 years. So happy to wax lyrical on this. Got a lot of content. As Justin said, my name is Tom Proctor. As I just said, I work for Rights and Democracy as the Housing Justice Organizer. And I head up the Just Cause Eviction campaign and have done since its infancy back in the spring of 2020. So why do we need Just Cause? I'm going to be real brief on this part because it's certainly up for debate. The perspective that we take that, as I mentioned, during the pandemic, housing costs in Burlington rose to 107% from what it was pre-pandemic. Housing costs overall in Vermont rose to 40%. This made first-time home buying very much out of reach for the majority of Vermonters. And as this expanded housing inequality, it's put economic power into the hands of landlords in a city where available housing units currently sit at under 1%. And there is no reasonable plan or no plan that I'm aware in the pipeline to actually increase affordable housing units in Burlington or really in Vermont in any meaningful way. Post-pandemic, no cause eviction went from making up 10% of eviction cases across Vermont to making up over 50% of evictions across Vermont. And the biggest impact of no cause evictions is actually landlords refusing to re-sign leases with current tenants. So whereas a lot of the court cases these days are no cause eviction court cases, the vast majority of eviction cases do not ever see a courthouse. There's multiple reasons for this. But it's mostly because if you have an eviction on your record, then it is very, very, very difficult to get housing again, because you are required to tell a new landlord that you have been evicted. So most evictions that do happen under the radar. So the fact that no cause evictions now make up 50% of recorded cases is alarm bells, because it does mean the likelihood is that percentage is far, far higher. As I said, this is mostly in the form of landlords refusing to re-sign leases with current tenants. So not re-signing a lease or not allowing a current tenant to re-sign a lease is often used as a threat to tenants to prevent complaints regarding code violations and/or landlord harassment. And this might not necessarily even be a landlord harassing that particular tenant, or a landlord saying to that tenant, don't say anything about code violations, otherwise I will not re-sign a new lease. This is very much tenants that are intimidated by the very idea of landlords and the power that they have to be able to deny them housing. And so they don't say anything out of fear of not having a house the next year. And as I said, with a less than 1% vacancy rate, rents going just skyrocketing in the past couple of years, that is a really genuine threat and a really genuine anxiety a lot of renters have. And so that not allowing people to re-sign a new lease is a massive part to play in that. On top of that, this has now led to unfit housing units that are being rented at ever increasing prices, with no incentive for landlords to provide adequate housing for tenants. The combination of these factors make it untenable for lower or even middle income residents to live in Burlington or even across Vermont in safe and affordable housing. And it is fast approaching a critical issue in the state. The passage of Just Cause Eviction will be a progressive step to alleviating this crisis. I am under no illusions that this is the silver bullet that's going to solve our housing crisis. There is 1,000 more things that we need to do in order to do that, including high density urban housing, getting rid of a bunch of code restrictions, encouraging co-housing models, and a plethora of other things that we could do to help with the housing crisis we're currently seeing. Pressure on UVM would be a good start for this as well. But Just Cause Eviction is a very basic tenant protection law that has been implemented in 4 different states, multiple different municipalities, and at least will start us on the road to creating adequate protections for tenants, while also honoring the will of the people who voted for this measure with a 63% majority in the spring of 2021. So that's the general overview of why I personally believe just cause eviction is very much needed at the moment. But I want to kind of go through the process of how we got to this moment. So for those that don't know, just cause eviction passed out of the House today on a voice vote. We are very proud of that, and we're excited to see what's going to happen in the Senate. But it has been a very, very long journey. And a lot of things that I hear from various members of the public, from lawmakers as well, is that this process is being cooked up by some left-wing communist city council who did no due diligence and didn't really think about this at all, and just trying to pass another Burlington law that's going to be cumbersome to the rest of us. And I can't tell you how far from the truth that is. This has been a very, very long and arduous process. As I said, the process started back in spring of 2020. There was a white paper that was submitted to the CD&R committee by Legal Aid that demonstrated the devastation of no cause evictions and has in our community, and how just cause as a policy has been implemented in other states and municipalities to alleviate some of those issues that we were seeing from no cause evictions. The white paper was considered by the CD&R committee, and a tentative JCE policy was slowly drawn up for the Burlington charter change. During this process, the public were invited to comment and explain their positions and experiences with rental housing in Burlington. This public input included tenants, homeowners, businesses, housing experts, and landlords, as well as just regular property owners. This took a long, long time. And the CD&R committee took this process very seriously. It had Sarah Carpenter in there, who is a long-time housing expert in Vermont, Brian Pine, now the current head of CEDO, and Zariah Hightower, who is an incredibly sharp woman. She went to Yale. And they really did take this very seriously. They picked over everything. And it wasn't until the fall of 2020 that the policy was ready to move on to the Charter Change Committee. Once it got to the Charter Change Committee, the scrutiny and input continued to be rigorously applied. Joan Shannon, the South End City Councillor and no fan of just cause eviction, with the help of Bill Ward, who is the Chief Code Inspector of the City of Burlington, extended an invite for input to every known landlord that operates in Burlington. That email was sent sometime in, I believe, October of last year. Last year. There was in that committee again for several weeks. There was at least 4 meetings until the Charter Change Committee voted on just cause eviction, and it got out of the committee. On the advice of the City Council, just cause eviction then went back to CD&R committee for further discussions and further edits. And after 3 more meetings of the CD&R committee, the policy eventually passed by unanimous vote. It was then taken up by the full City Council, who would debate and vote on whether or not it would be on the 2021 Town Hall meeting agenda. This was in December of 2021. December of 2020, sorry. After it was on the agenda and debated for a 3rd consecutive week by the full City Council, the policy and language was eventually approved to be placed on the ballot in a rare tripartisan vote, passing out of the City Council on a 10-2 vote. So we had Ali Deng, Karen Paul, Sarah Carpenter, and Franklin Paulino, who joined the 6 progressive City Councillors in voting for this to be put on the ballot. I can provide the details of all the work that was done by CD&R committee. It is on the Burlington City website. It is not actually an exhaustive list of all the people that commented and the public input that came into that, but it is a pretty decent look at what a lot of people were saying, and it does have opinions from everyone from property owners to landlords to tenants to lawmakers. What then followed was an intense and often contentious campaign to persuade the voters of Burlington to either approve or reject a just cause eviction charter change. At Rising Democracy, we created a just cause coalition, including Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition, and other organizations dedicated to passing the charter. In the main, this was made up of grassroots activists with organizational support. Our volunteers handed out 16,000 pieces of literature. We put out God knows how many lawn signs. We phone banked thousands of people, and we tried to get people up to speed on this charter change. At the end of the day, it is fairly wonky. We also did debates, and we talked to every single MPA meeting in the city. To do this, we had to raise some money. We actually ended up raising about $4,000. However, our opponents, which are the Vermont Landlords Association and the Vermont Realtors Association, have far deeper pockets, and they end up raising $41,597, which they mostly spent on sending out mailers and paying people to do phone banking for them. There was also another group that operated in the shadows. They never actually registered their group, which meant it was impossible to know who was involved in the campaign, who was funding it. They actually distributed inflammatory, misogynistic, and racist lawn signs across Burlington in their green spaces in an attempt to scare the tenants to vote against the charter change bill. We never actually found out who ran that group, but one person did actually end up stepping forward to say that she was involved, but not the ringleader. You can look that up in 7 days, and again, I'm happy to provide the link for that. But all being said, by the time that the town meeting day rolled around, the people of Burlington were very aware of the charter, the implications of the policy, and what the arguments were for passing or rejecting just cause eviction. Furthermore, every registered voter in Burlington received a full text of the charter change, thanks to our COVID necessitated mail-in voting initiative. So this is different from years past, where you just get a truncated form version of the question on your ballot. In this case, because it was a mail-in voting year, you got the full text of every single charter it was up to be voted on that year. So everyone knew exactly what they were voting on, or at least had the opportunity to find out. That night, this time of last year, basically 2021, March 2021, we were delighted when we got 63% of the vote and got a majority in every single one of the 8 wards in Burlington, including those that have been historically reluctant for things like tenant protections, mostly the New North End and the Hill section. The step that we had to take then after that was to go to the State House. So when a charter goes through, it then has to be taken up by the State House to approve or reject that charter. So the first step in this was for it to go to the House Government Operations Committee, where it began debate at the end of January of this year. Once again, that process has been rigorous. There were 12 people brought before the committee to speak on just cause, with some witnesses testifying multiple times, and it was brought up for debate on 6 occasions to be marked up or voted on. The witnesses that were called were Brian Pine, the CEDO director, Sarah Carpenter, Ward 4 Democratic City Councillor, current chair of the CDNR committee, co-author of the JCE charter change, former ED of Cathedral Square, former ED of the Vermont Housing Finance Agency, and the current chair of the Vermont Rental Housing Advisory Board, Representative Kelly Paella. She's an independent representative from Wyndham, Bennington, and Windsor, and previously housing insecure for many, many months with 2 young boys and 2 cats when she was no cause evicted from her home and had to live in a tent for 6 months. After that, she lived on couches, again, as she was a representative in the State House. We also had Ryan Murphy, who's a statewide housing navigator for CVOEO and sits on the front lines of the eviction crisis, getting calls in from people who are currently being evicted and offering advice. We had Devon Ayres, who does the same thing, but for VT Legal Aid. We had Jim Holway, a small Burlington landlord. We had Lisa Black, who is a disabled tenant that lives in a Redstone property in Winooski. She is currently facing 2 eviction notices and a non-renewal notice from Redstone. Actually requested that they make her apartment ADA compliant. They refused, and now they won't re-sign a lease. We had Angela Ziosakowski, who is the executive director of the Vermont Landlords Association, Julia Curry, another small Burlington landlord, Larry Miller, another small to medium-sized Burlington landlord, and Eric Hoekstra, who is the managing partner of Redstone Properties, and also Dan Richardson, the Burlington City Attorney. In total, there were 5 people invited to provide testimony from the perspective of landlords. There were only 2 tenants who actually got asked to do the same. And it should be noted that at least 3 of the members of the 11-person committee talked about their experiences as landlords, which is reflective of the entire State House, where over 50% of the sitting politicians are landlords themselves. And it is fair to say in this process, landlords and their interests have been heavily overrepresented. Following the testimony, some members of the House GovOps Committee were still unhappy that the charter would give Burlington City Council the authority to create just cause ordinance rules, and they claimed they needed stronger guardrails to protect landlords from such a measure. Acting on his own, or maybe in partnership with other committee members, Representative John Gannon, who is a landlord, worked with the Legislative Council to insert language into the Just Cause Eviction Charter, an authority any committee in the State House can do to charter changes if it's in their possession. Some changes were benign, some hinder protections for tenants. Most, in the main, we did get rid of some of the worst ones, but there is some left which could hamper the bill. All that to say, it finally got onto the floor last Friday, where we got a 98 to 49 vote to offer veto-proof majority. And today we got a voice vote to send it to the Senate. But needless to say, it's been a rigorous and very thorough process so far. At any moment, any time this gets voted on, if it gets rejected, it gets rejected for good. If it gets approved, it just moves on to the next round. We're looking at the moment to go into Senate GovOps at the end of March. After that, it will go to the full Senate for approval. And then if that is being approved by the Senate, then it will go to Phil Scott, where I almost guarantee it will get vetoed. So we will have to try and find enough votes for a veto-proof majority. Needless to say, it's not been easy, and it's not going to be easy, and we've got a long road left to go. So that is the general process, where we're at and how we got there. I am now going to go over the actual charter language itself, because there has been a lot of misinformation about this, a lot of confusion about this, and so I'm just going to kind of go through it and just kind of talk about how this is going to work. So would you mind if you just give me share screen capabilities so I can pop that? Thank you. Okay, so this is the current draft as it is right now, how it faced the House. So introduced by Committee on Government Operations. It's a charter change. And this whole bump is basically about how the General Assembly approves the amendment of the Charter, the City of Burlington to be set forth within this act, a load of legal mumbo jumbo. So this is where we get to the nitty gritty of it. So what this charter change will allow is for the City of Burlington to create an ordinance to protect residential tenants from evictions without a just cause. A just cause in this instance means a material breach of the written rental agreements. So say, for example, don't have cats, they have a cat, that's a breach, that is a just cause. A tenant's violation of state statutes regulating tenant obligations in residential rental agreements, that is basically the regulations that tenants currently have set out by the state government, and if you break them, then that again is a just cause. Non-payment of rent, that's a pretty standard one. Tenants' failure to accept written reasonable good faith renewal terms. So if you have a tenant for that for a couple of years and you don't have anything in your lease about smoking inside, it is your property, you don't like the smell anymore, you think it's going to bring down the house price, you put in your lease that you don't want that tenant to smoke anymore, and that tenant continues to smoke in the house, that is a just cause to evict. That would be a breach of written rental agreement. If you present the tenant with a new lease that says you're not allowed to smoke in the house, and the tenant goes, I'm not signing this unless you take that off, it doesn't matter, that tenant then has to leave. They either have to re-sign a rental agreement with reasonable changes, or they have to leave. Substantial damage to the property by the tenant, members of the tenant's household, or guests, that was added by the Government Operations Committee. Behavior of the tenant, member of the tenant's household, or guest that adversely affects the health and safety of the tenants, landlords, or landlords' representatives. Again, added by the GovOps committee. I'm not sure exactly how a lawyer would adjudicate that, or judge would adjudicate that, but yeah, I guess it's fairly self-explanatory in its how it's laid out. Criminal activity on the premise of the rental property, or any criminal threat against a landlord or landlord's representative. This should already be covered really by the violating state statutes regulating tenant obligations. I'm not sure why they put this in. But basically, yeah, if you do any criminal activity, that is a just cause. But frankly, that would also be breaking state rules on tenancy anyway. And that's it. That is what would be considered a just cause. So breach of written rental agreement, violation of state statutes regarding tenants' obligations, non-payment of rent, failure to accept renewal terms that are slightly different to the ones previously, substantial damage to the property if you have somehow hurt the landlord or a landlord's representative, any criminal activity on the property. They are all just causes. That is considered a just cause under this charter change. The ordinance that will be written after this charter change shall exclude from just cause the expiration of a rental agreement for the sole grounds of termination of tenancy. So a landlord will be required to renew a lease with their current tenants, so long as the tenants have not breached any of the issues in this first half. So if a tenant has kept to their rental agreement, if they have kept to the state statutes on tenant behavior, if they have paid their rent on time, if they accept the new renewal terms, if they've not damaged the property, if they have behaved well, if they have not committed any criminal activity, then that landlord would be required to give that tenant the right of first refusal on a new lease. This, however, does have some stipulations attached. A landlord is not required to do this if they live in an owner-occupied duplex or triplex. So if you are a landlord that lives in a triplex, your tenants aren't covered by just cause rules. If you are taking that property off the rental market, again, that's not considered a violation of these ordinances. So say you are selling it to a private individual who's going to be living into that property, that is absolutely fine. You are allowed to evict your tenant based on that. Also the same if you have, like, say, your mother or your sister or a cousin that will be, I don't know actually if cousin does get counted as immediate family member, but if an immediate family member is moving in, again, you're allowed to get rid of that tenant. If the property itself needs substantial renovations that preclude occupancy. Now, we don't know what substantial means yet. When we were writing this, we talked about any repairs that are equal to 50% of what the property is worth, but that was just spitballing about 2 years ago now. So that will be sorted out at the ordinance level. So those are the three ways that those tenants will not be covered by just cause laws. Again, if you live in the duplex or triplex, if you are taking the property off the rental market or allowing an immediate family member to move in, or if that property needs substantial repairs, again, those tenants then are not covered by those just cause eviction laws. The ordinance will include provisions that will mitigate potential negative impacts on tenant and property owners, including requirements for adequate notice and reasonable relocation expenses that will not exceed the value of 1 month's rent or another amount negotiated by the landlord and tenant. The exceeding that 1 month's rent part was put in by the Government Operations Committee, but the general idea, or at least the intent behind this part, is that if you do need to get rid of a tenant for one of these reasons that we have seen above, one of these two reasons, sorry, then you have to give adequate notice. So at the moment it's 60 days in Vermont. That would probably be extended in the ordinance. And you're required to give financial compensation for moving costs because it is very difficult to find a new place in Burlington or elsewhere across Vermont. Let's see. The ordinance will also include a provision that will provide for a 1-year probationary period after initial occupancy. That means if a tenant moves in, say, this year, and you want them gone and to move on to another tenant by the next year, that is something you can do at the moment based on this language. The just cause rules and protections don't kick in until that tenant enters the 2nd year of occupancy in that place. And it will also include a provision that will limit unreasonable rent increases to prevent de facto evictions or non-renewals, although this shall not be construed as limit rents beyond the purpose of preventing individual evictions. So this would be a set amount of, you're allowed to increase your rent X amount over X period, And that's to stop, say, a landlord doubling the rent and forcing a tenant out that way. And there's a very ambiguous one that again was put in by the Government Operations Committee. The ordinance will include provisions that mitigate potential impacts on small landlords, which is so vague as to be useless. And finally, the ordinance shall define what is reasonable and adequate notice in defining just cause, and shall require that landlords provide notice of just cause and other legal requirements as part of the rental agreement. And this is a clause that we put in to make sure that landlords tell their tenants exactly what their rights are when moving in. So that's something we thought was very important. So that's the charter change in a nutshell. Now, I just want to be clear, it could change still in the Senate. Every committee has the right to change the language when it's in their possession, as does the floor of whatever chamber it's in. So it got changed in GovOps, the House GovOps. It might get changed again in Senate GovOps, but we don't have very much power over that. That comes down to the senators themselves. Okay, so I want to stop there before I get into frequently asked questions. I don't know, Justin, what do you think? I could go into the frequently asked questions now. It just feels like I've talked a lot, and I kind of want to give people kind of a bit of a space to breathe.
Yeah, sure. So if you want, we can take a brief 5-minute break. So just we can kind of absorb all that information and then come back for FAQs and Q&A.
Yeah, sure thing. And I'll put that the link for the actual language in the chat. So if anyone during the break wants to kind of go over this in their own time in this short break, they can. Yeah, happy to answer some questions when everyone gets back.
Okay, awesome. So we'll reconvene at 7:52 then. Okay, so I think we'll give just a few minutes for people to get back to their screens. I don't know, I was amused during the short break. This is the first time that I've heard rain outside for a while, so it's actually kind of soothing. Take it over snow.
It's gonna be like mid-50s tomorrow as well.
Yeah,
But
no,
definitely-
I'm not excited for it to go back to the 30s over the weekend though.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I feel like we've broken the back of winter, you know? We had
Yeah,
those like 3 blindingly cold weeks, and then it feels like now we're I wouldn't
yeah.
say out the woods, but at least can see the pathway out the woods.
Can imagine. I'm just not too happy because I have like two big snowbanks from the plows like right by my back stoop, so they keep melting and then freezing over completely, and it's just a sheet of ice trying to get out of the house. Okay.
So I can either, I've got a little PowerPoint on frequently asked questions, but I feel like it might be a better idea just to hear questions from people and see if I can address them, because if they're my frequently asked questions are as frequently asked, and so I'm assuming a few of them are going to come up here. So, what do you think about just opening up a Q&A, Justin?
Yeah, I think that sounds great.
Well, when we're talking about affordable housing, I'm not sure, maybe Stephen understands because he's done some construction in the past. But do you gentlemen realize how expensive it is to build an apartment building right now? I'm currently, so just to be on the clear here, I own one duplex in Burlington. I do own quite a few rentals throughout Chittenden County, but I only have one duplex in Burlington. I'm currently building 70 units in Essex, and that building is probably going to cost me between $7 and $8 million to build. So that's a little over $100,000 per unit. Now, I'm not sure what you would consider to be affordable housing, and maybe understanding why the prices of real estate in general in Burlington and everywhere jumped up so much. And a lot of that is because of the cost of materials to build. Obviously, if it costs you X amount to rebuild that same structure today, that makes that existing structure worth roughly that amount. Hence the reason why a house in Burlington went from 200,000 to 400,000. So how do we solve the issue of affordable housing?
Yeah, but I got to kind of just question your premise there. I understand that the cost of building materials have gone up substantially over the pandemic. Yes. I don't think they've gone up to 107% of what they previously were. I think the major influx of, the massive rise in house pricing is largely due to far more realtor speculation that's going on in Vermont right now. Obviously, the cost of housing, creating housing has gone up. I'm not denying that. I would love to see figures that it's gone up 107% of what it was pre-pandemic.
Let me tell you that a 2x4 pre-pandemic was $2 or less. That same 2x4 during the pandemic went up to $8 and $10. A sheet of plywood used to be $8 for a sheet of OSB plywood, is now $70 to $80 for that same sheet.
Right. No,
So,
I get you, but you're saying that you're creating housing that would be 100 grand per unit to create, right? Whereas I'm sure that if it's in Burlington for even a 1 unit house, we're still looking at about 200 grand, which would make a profit margin of about 100 grand there.
So pre-pandemic, it would cost normally $115 per square foot for me to assemble a building. Now it's costing between $300 and $400 a square foot to build that same building. Just to give you a rough idea.
Right, but as you said before, it costs about, if you said that you're creating a building, it's going to cost $7 million. It's about 100 grand per unit to create. How much is your estimation that those units would end up getting sold for if you sold for them individually?
Well, they're going to be 1-bedroom units. If we were to sell them, I would assume they'd sell for 150,000. Be my guess, but they're going to be rentals, and they'll rent at market rate between 13 and 1,500.
Right. Yeah. So I guess it doesn't quite add up that it's only because of the cost of building materials that we're seeing that this massive rise in how much it costs to buy housing in Burlington across Vermont. I'll also say there is currently a bill which I believe Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition is supporting that would subsidize building costs for developers across Vermont.
Subsidize them for, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. There's actually a couple of bills directed towards, one is directed towards subsidizing the cost of construction with the idea that, well, if we can bring the cost of putting the building up down, then all the other costs come down. The housing folks are kind of trying to wrap their head around it because it's kind of a new approach to addressing the problem. And so some folks who have been doing this work for a long time are kind of still asking a lot of questions about it, but that's on the table. Also, the Omnibus housing bill, there's a bill in pertaining to 1,000,001 different housing things. We're calling it an omnibus bill. It's this big bill, which is still very much being assembled, and it deals with I would say, Tom and I talked about this earlier, I would say that the whole bill, all 66 pages of it, is directed more towards how do we get past the barriers of getting buildings up than they are towards because as you know, as a developer, there's a pile of minutia that you got to deal with, the permitting, the zoning. So it includes things like, as you know, in some places, do you want to put up a building? You have to go through all the details with permitting for connecting the pipes. And then you have to go through the same process again with the state. And they're saying, why do they have to go through this process twice? That's twice the cost, twice the time. And while you go through all this, the permit you got in the first place might expire. So they want to change like the expiration date on the permit. They want to streamline the permitting process in general.
Let's not forget the impact fees.
Right, and all
Those are huge.
So, and in one of the hearings, they were talking about how, in looking at the cost of a project that had largely fake numbers, but to get the point across of that, like, there's all these costs that there don't need to be, and someone's going to pay those. And so that, of course, that goes into the cost of the housing. So if we can eliminate this, we can bring the price down. And there's actually a part of the omnibus bill that also talks about eliminating the sales tax on materials used for the construction of housing. Because they're kind of saying we can't control the price of lumber, which, as you said, has, and I will admit I'm doing other work at the same time. So I might have missed some of this, but I think that you were just talking about the price of lumber and how it's kind of gone up and down through the course of the pandemic. And so the legislature is saying we can't control the price of lumber, but let's work on the things we can control. And one thing that we can control is sales tax. So is it the magic bullet? God, no. But maybe all these things, we add it all up, can at least help on that end. And I think that the subsidies for builders helps, and the developers helps, it helps meet the cost of building the building. It lowers the price for the person who's moving into it. And it allows the developers to still make their living. So I think that it kind of, I think it's a solution that's really worth considering. So, and I'm sorry to take up so much time. I know that we're talking about just cause eviction, but I just wanted to speak to those things because I sit in these meetings all day long. So it's nice to use the knowledge once in a while.
Well, we're discussing affordable housing, so anything we can do to make housing more affordable, it's good, good knowledge.
And
The
I'd just like to
standard-
kind of come in here and to kind of bring it back to kind of just cause and how that's kind of related. We're seeing a lot right now in terms of top-down approach to try and bring down the cost of housing, which is obviously something I'm very much supportive of. I'm a very big fan of high density urban housing, but we also need to be able to do a bottom-up approach as well. So those that are living in those rental properties, they are also protected. So it's all well and good to bring down the cost of how to make a $7 million house, but you guys got to make sure that the people that will be renting within that $7 million apartment unit are protected and are able to live in secure, safe housing without the threat of, like, say, for example, eviction over the top of their heads.
Sure.
So it's important to take this from both angles.
Yep, and I think affordable housing is an important part of that, because obviously if the apartment's affordable, it's easier for the tenant to pay their rent on time.
Tom, I think that if we can focus on the just cause legislation that's pending, I think that there's something that you might be forgetting, which is the good advice that comes with the pro just cause arguments includes landlords just need to be better at being a landlord. So from Earhart to CVOEO to the Coalition to End Homelessness, the advice I've gotten is that I need to screen tenants better. So if you're a true affordable housing advocate, you wouldn't be telling me to screen better, you'd be telling me to screen less, which means that those with a conviction would still be eligible. Those with an eviction would still be eligible. Those with a crummy credit score would still be eligible. And those with a spotty employment record would still be eligible. But the fact is this: incarceration is disproportionately affecting a specific group of people. Evictions tend to disproportionately affect lower income, which tends to be, again, the BIPOC. The spotty credit scores. I have a tenant. I offered to help get her registered so that she would get her utilities paid. And she said, please don't help me. The utilities are in her daughter's name. And what happens with lower income families is they sometimes burn through their kids' names or records in order to keep accounts live, whether it's a cell phone or a utility bill. And kids come of age with a low credit score that they can never beat. On the other hand, affluent families often send their kids off to college with a prepaid credit card and a great credit score. And the fourth one is single mothers with children. Spotty employment record. Well, yes, of course, because they've kind of been dealing with, and yet they won't qualify. So my point here is, for all this talk of just cause eviction, keep in mind it carries the luggage, the baggage of having a completely negative impact. Because if I followed the direction of the geniuses that are behind it, I would be a better screener, and I would eliminate large groups of people from eligibility to rent in the properties that I own and manage. And here's the irony. Those are the people that need your help the most, and they're getting it the least. And the ramification is those that should be your partners in developing affordable housing and making sure that they qualify to rent those apartments are the ones that you're actually advising us to exclude. And this is absolutely shameful that can actually, that those comments or directions to screen better just dismisses our concerns of what happens with a problem tenant. So my question is this: with just cause, when I have a problem tenant, what do I do? And if anyone ever tells me again, you should have screened better so you didn't have a problem tenant, I'm a low barrier landlord. You want partners like me. You want people that will help someone who's been incarcerated, has an eviction, wants a second chance, has a crummy credit score, and for whatever reason, like everybody has history, everybody deserves a shot. But if the just cause eviction is built on a foundation of landlords just need to exclude large quantities of people in order for this to work, that's not a housing solution in any way, shape, or form. It is the illusion. It's the talk of housing as a human right. But if it's based on, let's exclude all these people before we dispense the housing as a human right, then that's a sham. And I think this is something that the just cause movement needs to own, is if the organizers of this movement keep proposing that landlords screen better, then it's not a housing rights issue, and you're not supporting affordable housing. You're supporting a small niche group of people that qualify based on, excluding all those criteria. You haven't solved the problem. You've ignored the problem and made it a bigger problem because they're now unhousable.
Stefan, I couldn't agree more with you, man. I never in my life is the words "where you need to screen better" come out of my mouth when it comes to landlords and talking about tenants. I very much respect Erhard for all the work that he's done on affordable housing in Vermont for several decades. I think he's done a fantastic job of making sure that the Vermont Affordable Housing Coalition is very well respected in the State House and managed to get through some very important housing legislation. Doesn't mean we fully agree with each other on the ways that we've approached just cause eviction. I can say, as someone who has been in this from the very beginning, this has never been an argument that I've used, that we should be screening tenants better. No, I am all for low or no barrier housing. It frankly disgusts me when I hear about any kind of barrier housing for houseless folks when it comes to any shelters that we have, or like the motels that we use, or the houseless shelters that are open and you're only allowed to get food or a bed if you say a prayer or have to turn up sober. No, I'm fully agreeing with you. Everyone deserves a house, regardless of what their background is, regardless of what their credit check is, regardless of whether or not they're sober, regardless of what their credit score is. 100% agree with you. I would love to work with you more, Stefan, and you too, Gabe. If you are making affordable housing, I think this is something that we need to approach from both angles. It's not just about protecting tenants, it's also about making those barriers a lot lower in order to be able to build with high density in urban centers. That's how we solve the housing crisis, is by building more houses. I don't believe that landlords should be able to discriminate on things like, have you been previously evicted? I've always been a massive advocate of banning the box, for instance. I don't think that people should need to have references in order to be able to get housing. So I personally, and I can only say this for myself and the person, as someone that has been advocating this for the past 2 years, that's not been my argument at all. I believe that tenants should be protected, and often, regardless of their background, and often it's tenants who are getting evicted, as you said, high proportion of marginalized folks, high proportion of minority folks, high proportion of new Americans, either based on their previous history or because their landlord suspects that they have previous history and makes a judgment before they've really got to know the person. So I will say wholeheartedly, I do not respect that argument in terms of why we should be putting in just cause eviction and the fact it should be on the landlords to screen better. No, I don't think it should be on landlords to screen better. Frankly, they screen enough as it is, too much already. And I'm more about putting in just cause eviction because of the countless stories I get in my inbox on a weekly basis, daily basis at the moment, on folks that are getting evicted without cause for no other reason than, well, landlord either sees a proffer elsewhere, or the person's become inconvenient, or the person's disabled, which is another one I've come across on more than one occasion. So no, I'm in total agreement with you, Stefan, and I would love to work with you more on how we actually make more affordable housing.
Well, then, if that being said, you mentioned You mentioned evictions for certain things, but I think that that's the tip of the iceberg, because what we're excluding or ignoring is the fact that the non-rental to those same people is of much greater, for example, disability. So someone in a, let's say in a chair. Well, not renting to them in the first place is the crime, right? So if someone's getting evicted for something that was obvious until it, like what prompted that eviction? Like today, I just woke up and decided.
Do you want me to go over?
And I know there's.
I
know there's
can go
anecdote.
over a particular tenant's testimony if you want. She's called Lisa Black. She was a tenant, is currently a tenant in a Redstone apartment in Winooski. She's had 15 major surgeries over the last few years.
Right.
And when she moved into this apartment in Winooski, the Redstone property, she noted that there were several things on her walk-in sheet that were not ADA compliant based on the injuries and disabilities that she had. When she complained about it to Redstone, they came around and they only made one fix, and that was to replace a fire door with a non-fire door, which was then not fire compliant because she couldn't open it. What she needed was a self-opening door. She kept complaining. They then wouldn't do an inspection. They then asked her to get a medical record to say that she was actually disabled. Now, this woman was a physician's assistant for 25 years and is legally allowed to actually call to designate someone else as disabled, but needless to say, she'd been designated disabled long time ago. So that request in itself was not just insulting, but also seemed punitive. After then, she eventually withheld rent because they wouldn't make the necessary repairs to make her apartment ADA compliant. They then tried to evict her for non-payment of rent. And in the meantime, have said they're not going to renew her lease. So it seems, at least, that her no cause eviction or non-renewal of lease is a discriminatory eviction, because Redstone realized it's going to cost more money for them to update that apartment than they will get off her over X amount of years, which I'm assuming predict that she'll be there for.
Now, Tom, do you realize that it's not actually the landlord's responsibility to make those kinds of improvements to an apartment? A tenant can make the request, but however, a tenant with a disability, such as somebody that rents who is blind, or actually deaf would be a better example. Somebody who's deaf needs a strobe type alarm in their apartment. Say that the building's has an alarm system, and instead of a sounder type, they need a strobe type that would hopefully wake them up. Now, they would make that request. It's still actually the tenant's responsibility to pay for that upgrade for their disability. It's not up to the landlord to make that change at their expense. So this woman who's made complaints to the landlord of Redstone, unless she was willing to, the landlord can't deny her a reasonable request, but she also has to understand that financial, cost is on her to make those changes to her apartment, should they allow it.
That's fair enough. Well, I don't know if it is fair enough, to be honest, but if that is the law, that's what it is. They refused to do an ADA compliance walkthrough on 2 separate occasions. So the request that she's making, they're not willing to kind of inspect the place in order to be able to say, okay, this is what you need and this is what we'll do. Even if it then comes down to her paying for it, which I'm sure she'll actually gladly do, because she doesn't want to have to move again, because it's so difficult to try and find an apartment in Burlington or in the surrounding areas that is actually suitable for someone with her kind of disabilities.
Well, not only would it be her responsibility to make those changes, the landlord can also request that she change it back to its original condition upon her leaving.
Right, but I'm saying the landlord's refusing to do the work full stop, even if she was to pay.
Well, they may refuse to do the work. I guess it's hard to understand exactly without hearing her testimony or what she's asked for. Because I know in my history, I've had tenants with disabilities come to me. They want to make certain changes, and if they're reasonable requests, then it's no issue. I'm not sure what request she's made.
She requested, so the testimony she gave was to the Housekeeping Operations Committee. So it has all been recorded, and I can actually get that recording because I sent it to someone the other day. So I'll pop that in the chat, and you can feel free to give it a read. Sorry, give it a watch, and get back to me, because I'm not a lawyer.
Sure.
I'm just a housing advocate, and so I don't know the ins and outs of that. I'm sure you know it a lot better than I do, being a landlord. But yeah, I'll be really interested to hear your take on it after listening to her testimony.
Happy to do that. Back to evictions being on somebody's record, and you don't feel that that's something a landlord should be able to take into account for somebody applying for an apartment. Why would you feel that way? I mean, it's to me, I liken it to you want to lease a car. To lease that car, you have a credit check done. They check your driving record for your insurance. It's to me, you're trusting somebody with your property, same as a dealership's trusting somebody with their car to drive for 3 years. Why would you not want a landlord to be able to do the same kind of check as somebody who's leasing a car?
Well, I feel like Stefan should answer that one, or unless you want.
A couple different folks.
Sorry about that. I feel like Stefan could answer that one, as Stefan was talking about low or no barrier housing, and why that is so important for everyone, regardless of what your history is.
Well, I think that there's two parts to that. First of all, a landlord's desire or preference for what housing they provide and who they market to, I think is their, right. If you want to build something that's, hugely expensive on an island in the middle of a beautiful lake, you're going to price it accordingly and you're going to market it accordingly. If the state of Vermont and the affordable housing advocates want the private sector to invest in affordable housing that's low barrier, it must work, and we should be partners in making it work. And the just cause legislation isn't that partnership. It's removing the no cause eviction, which I would suggest any self-respecting landlord or property owner is going to rent to good tenants and hope they stay forever. Turnover just means the place goes fallow. I got to paint it. I got to replace the carpet. I got to put in new flooring. I got to, the list goes on. And when I had a tenant the other day that said, man, this is the best place I ever had. I want to live here forever. And I thought, hallelujah. You know what? I'll tell me what I need to do. I'll change the curtains. I'll come by periodically, to do the thing you want, because I want you to be happy. And I think that at the end of the day, any self-respecting business person that owns property and invests of their resources in housing has a vested interest in making it work. And I think that that's something we should look for, as opposed to besmirchifying and stigmatizing property owners as the enemy. We're the solution. 85% of the affordable housing is provided by the private sector. We should be front and center in the conversations so that we can say, how can we create more affordable housing? If there's 1% vacancy rates and we're all chewing on the scraps for that 1%, we're not coming up with a solution. We're just looking for, we're fighting over 1%. And if we're living in denial, if we forget the fact that how heating fuel, BT Digger had an article a month or two ago about Scott here at Rutland Fuel and the prices he was charging 1 year ago, it's gone up 75%. Based on what I pay today, it's gone up 75% in 1 year, 12 months. And my tenant has the window open because that's easier than adjusting the thermostat. So you see, if we're going to do anecdotes, we can do them all day long, but we haven't gotten any closer to a solution. The solution is this: if you're a housing advocate, the solution is housing. And so the first thing I would suggest is look for the folks that are creating and providing the housing and say, how can we do good or faster, better together? And if you look at this fair, whatever it's called, this bill, the just cause, here's the funny thing. It has exceptions. So it allows for evictions. Like, why do duplex owners get to be, tossing people out based on the whimsy of whatever. And the fact of the matter is, it's a political decision. So we all believe in eviction because you put it in there. The just cause eviction says that a person with a triplex can evict. In other words, Earhart, who says, I'm a landlord, I'm one of you. No, you own a duplex or a triplex. So this just cause doesn't apply to people who pretend that it does, but it doesn't. It doesn't apply to them.
I'm gonna have to push back on that one, man, because, well, one, I don't really want that part in myself, but second of all, the duplex triplex issue was because you would be living next to that person in that same building, and so as a property owner, picking who lives literally on the same property as you comes down to a quality of living issue. Now, I didn't want that duplex and triplex owners were exempt from this, but that's the way politics works, because there was so much influence from landlords, from property owners, from businesses in this process. These are the concessions they got. Now, of course,
right. But you know what? If I can push back, because you were pushing back when I was talking, so I'll do the same. Fair enough. Here's the deal. This is my neighborhood. So the fact that it's across the street, it affects the quality of my life. I live in this neighborhood. I live in this town. So it affects me. My properties are all walkable, and I walk them every day. So you see, the fact that we've drawn the line at duplexes, at triplexes, because the landlord lives there and is affected, because he lives in the neighborhood isn't affected, because he lives in the community and is affected, because he lives in the city. All we're doing there is moving a line, but it's not an absolute standard, which is where I come back to. We're just now debating where should the line be. And what I'm saying is reasonable landlords will not evict someone unless there's a reason. And when I say reasonable, I mean, like, why would you evict someone who's paying the rent and isn't an issue? But the no cause eviction allows for an eviction when we can't get the evidence necessary to go to court to evict. And there is where I'll offer an anecdote, which is quite simply this. I have a tenant that has a lease that says she can't sublet. She sublet to some bad boys who came to town for 2 weeks to do some major deals. Now, the police know, I know, but the fact of the matter is, I don't have the evidence to go to court and say she actually gave up her apartment and allow someone to run an illegal business out of it for 2 weeks. Okay, so when a property is being used as a drug house, how do I go to court? Because if the police take 2 years to build a case to clear a house, how do you think the average landlord's going to do? The only thing I have, the only tool I have is a no cause eviction, get it over with, and let's move on.
And you're still going to lose.
I'm still going to lose. It's going to cost. It's going to cost.
Then you're acting as judge, jury, and executioner without any kind of judicial process. We all have a right to face our accuser in court, right? You're denying someone their home because you believe that something happened in that property. You can't prove it. Well, if you can't prove it, I'm sorry, that's just the way the judicial system works in this country. That's why we don't live in a banana republic. You can't just accuse someone of doing something and then punish them for doing it just based on your
accusing. No, that's my point. I'm not accusing. I'm not. I'm using the no cause eviction.
Did these people get arrested and convicted?
Oh my God, Tom, I'm not accusing. I'm using a no cause eviction. And I wouldn't do that if I had a good tenant and everything was going well. So you see there.
Well, you are accusing. You're using a no cause eviction because you're accusing them, your tenant, of subleasing her apartment to drug dealers. That's what you're accusing her of doing, right?
No, I'm not. And this is the thing I'll tell you. Employers and landlords know better than to make an accusation that they can't spend months in court. This is where the cost of managing becomes exorbitant, and you have to ask yourself, if you create this burden of proof for landlords, you're going to discourage investment. Because I could do self-storage right now is a very lucrative direction to go with property. In other words, if you want people to invest their money in affordable housing, you've got to be in the business of removing obstacles for property owners as well as tenants. But you can't remove an obstacle and at the same time create one for someone else. So my question here is, how have we had some analysis of what obstacles do we need to remove so that relationships between tenants and landlords really work well? So I've heard,
Well,
we hear the anecdote, and the anecdote.
This is
The
why
anecdotes
it's been put in place in New Jersey. This is why it's been put in place in New Hampshire. This is why it's been put in place in California. This is why it's been put in place in Oregon. This is why it's been put in place in Philadelphia. This is why it's been put in place in New York City. This is why it's been put in place in DC. All of those housing markets are still alive and well. There is still a lot of landlords that operate in there and still make a very good profit. This does facilitate that relationship between landlord and tenant, because it means unless the landlord does have conclusive proof that someone is actually breaking one of the agreements within the ordinance, then unfortunately that person has to stay, because you can't prove it. You can't just be the arbiter between whether or not someone can live somewhere or not, unless they are.
I'm sorry, that wasn't a fair statement, what you just said. It's actually, if they're breaking the rules, if they're in units greater than 3 that aren't property, like, in other words, you're forgetting the clauses here, which contradict the sacredness of that statement.
Again,
it's arbitrary.
It's arbitrary. In there,
I know, but they exist. I know. I didn't say Tom wrote that. I said the just cause ordinance includes some very basic exceptions which contradict the conviction to the housing as a right. What it really means is housing is a right for some, or housing as a right in some circumstances, or housing as a right for good business people. One of them just said, one of the comments here in defense of the just cause was, property owners just need to be better business people. I'm like, that's so arrogant and insulting. Like, the only people that have problems are crummy landlords. So I think that we need to stop this adversarial. I still come back to this and look for what would work for both. And in this particular case, your entire lead up to this conversation was about the perspective of the tenants. And for this to work, really, it should include, this is what works for tenants and this is what works for landlords, and this is how we're going to bring it together so that the 85% of the housing stock, the affordable housing stock that's created and managed and maintained by the private sector, will be done professionally, with enthusiasm, in a partnership that's vibrant and works for everybody.
Thank you, Steve.
And I think that's missing from this conversation and the larger conversation. And so it's important that we work together, otherwise it becomes dueling anecdotes, and that gets us nowhere.
Well, just some facts then. In Burlington, 64% of people rent. All right. No cause evictions have gone up to over 50% during the pandemic, and people are being made houseless right now. When, at the moment, as a landlord, you're still making profit. And if you have problems with tenants, chances are you'll still end up making profit. With a tenant, when they get no cause evicted, they could end up dying from exposure or houselessness, or they could end up having to move their kids away from schools, or their families might have get split up, or they might lose their jobs, or they might not be able to have transportation links anymore, or one of a million other things that happens when you're housing insecure. So unfortunately, the end product is not equal right now. You, as a landlord, as a property owner, as someone that has capital, has more power than tenants. Tenants need more power, because the results of them not having power can end up in really, really, really serious consequences. So this redresses the balance between landlords and tenants a tiny, tiny, tiny bit, and just means that if you do have an accusation about a tenant breaking some kind of rule, that you have to prove it. And I don't think that's too much to ask in a place where we are meant to be relying on the rule of law.
So if you think that housing insecurity is something that should be addressed, the first thing you should do is avoid reducing housing stock. And if you do something that causes one property owner to pull out of the market, you've just caused more housing insecurity. The fact of the matter is the vacancy rate is nominal. it's so insignificant at 1%. It's probably attributable to units that are being painted and turned around. But the vacancy rate is so small. On a given day, I get I'm not listed anywhere. I get referrals. I get phone numbers all day. I'm getting phone numbers all day long. Right, but this I'm not. This isn't Tom. No, it's the just cause legislation is such a huge distraction from what could be a solution to increasing housing stock. You're not going to solve the housing crisis in Vermont if you gave every single tenant that's living in an apartment right now, if you gave them the right to stay there for 100 years, you have not housed one person. You have just kept people.
Stefan. I know this.
Exactly. So just cause is such a distraction from the brutal, because you talk about people that are going to housing insecurity and they're going to have to move the kids. Like, here's the deal. What if there were enough housing? And that's the conversation. Where's VHIP? Like, in other words,
with you, Stefan. I am with you. Get rid of zoning restrictions. Start building upwards. I'm 100% with you. We picked just cause as the issue to go with because it seemed the most immediate problem. It's been 2 years and change trying to get it to this far.
But you realize this legislation, all it's going to do is cause landlords to raise the bar. They're going to raise the bar. They're going to ask for higher credit scores, more background, more whatever. You're causing landlords to raise the bar and you're cutting out those people that might have had a chance before. That's what this legislation is going to do. And that's what I want you to understand. That's
a lot of those people are currently not finding housing right now and are currently suffering. And unfortunately, I've got to go. It's 8:30. I've talked about this all day. I don't think we're going to get to a place where we're going to be able to find some common ground. Stefan, I really do actually want to work with you when it comes to actually taking out zoning restrictions and building up and working with people making affordable housing. I really do. This is the legislation that we are championing right now. That does not mean that we are against other legislation that you've suggested, because I am incredibly for it. I get you. We do need to build more houses. We also need to protect tenants. These are two things that need to happen. We're doing one of them at the moment, and I'm more than happy to try and do something else as well. Nothing is going to be a silver bullet. I'm just more than happy and willing to work on everything.
Just
with that,
parting comment.
5 minutes over time right now.
Okay, just one parting comment, which is that last thing you said, which is to increase the amount of housing and do something to protect landlords. And I come back to this. You got to keep adding the word, no, you said tenants, protecting tenants. Keep saying protect or support tenants and landlords. Like, let's put everybody in the pot. Let's raise it for everybody. And let's consider the fact that there's a lot to be said for everybody's perspective. And then you'll, I think, find us working on each other's situations as opposed to it being adversarial.
Fair enough. Definitely taking it from a tenant's perspective, definitely see them as the people in bigger crisis, but I get you. Definitely want to work with you on other things. And I especially want to work on trying to get rid of zoning restrictions and co-housing. So if you want to talk about that at some point and how to get the ball rolling on that, I am all ears, because that is something that I really do want to throw myself into post JCE.
Gabe, what's your contact?
Mine?
Yeah.
I'll send it to you in the chat.
Okay.
All right.
Figure out how to use it.
See you around.
Thank you so much, Tom. And to conclude with that, I do know that VAHC is really looking to tackle the housing crisis, not just through just cause eviction, but through a lot of other issues like we talked about earlier in terms of trying to subsidize the cost of lumber and building materials and plenty of other issues. So with that, I want to thank you all for your time and for the conversation. To remind you all that a recording of this meeting will be made available on VAHC's YouTube page, and to please follow us on our website and our social media for future updates as we continue these conversations around other legislative priorities that VAHC has. So with that, thank you all so much for attending, and good night.
Thank you.